Hello and welcome to this second screencast for green infrastructure and sustainable cities. The first one we did looked at some of the logistics of the module and how it might fit into your different degree programs. This one will talk briefly about some of the key principles that we will be talking about and returning to over the course of the semester. And one thing to think about within green infrastructure is that we can always sort of take a step back and think about how what we're doing, where we're trying to apply these ideas, and what benefits we're trying to generate can fall back on or think about the principles we're going to talk about. So the first thing that we will do, and it's something that we will talk about quite a lot, is context. Because it's Chinese New Year this weekend, we thought we'd start in Shanghai and Beijing. And the reason we start here is because the way in which we use parks or we use green infrastructure or we plan for them is very much contextually driven. So we wouldn't do the same things in the UK as we might do in a Mediterranean country because of different temperatures and different climates. We wouldn't do the same things in India as we would do in Canada because the way in which people use these spaces varies dramatically. And so China's a very good lens through which to think about context, because the nature of green spaces, the nature of GI and the nature of parks can be construed to be both historically based in terms of how people view a park and what they think they should be seeing in those locations. From a more contemporary perspective, where you look at new designs and the influence of Western landscape architecture or outside influences on the form and the function of green infrastructure. And of course the pace of development in Chinese cities is leading to very significant questions about where GI can be fitted into this, what role GI might have in terms of promoting livability or health or well-being, and of course the economic values of GI. So these three pictures are just examples of how GI can be used in different ways. The picture on the left is from a flyover in the sort of the west of Beijing, and it's a dead space. It would be a space that would maybe be left unused in previous generations. But here they've created a small pocket park which uses the linearity of the motorway above it to structure the flow and the movement of the park. And on both sides of this park there are quite mature trees, which is blocking out some of the noise from the 8-lane highway to the left and this 4-lane highway above. And it does provide a place of not quite tranquility, but a calmer and more reflective location within a very bustling urban environment. So this is an example where a space which might have a lower economic or social value, which might have been left unattended to in previous generations, has now been used for a social function and providing quite a valuable green space for people who live locally. The picture in the middle is one of my favourites, something that we'll come back to again, and it's a lady singing in Suzhou Park in Suzhou. And this lady has a little entourage, and every day she comes to the park and sings a park karaoke, and her friends are there. There's a little man playing an instrument, and there's a community of people who use these spaces. And one of the things that we can think about in terms of the environment in China is the way in which parks act as a communal resource that actually allows people to interact with each other, particularly in high density areas where we may or may not have a private garden. And then the picture on the far right is an interesting example of how green spaces and GI is being co-opted for different reasons. So this is wedding photography in English Town outside Shanghai. It's a model town where people do live, but it's based on the architecture of the UK. And people go there to have their wedding pictures taken because that's a big and symbolic gesture within the wedding process in China. So people spend a lot of money and a lot of time travelling to have to get their pictures taken with the right backgrounds and the right locations. And you see that in other parts of Beijing, such as the Bund on the river, where people are trying to get the skyscrapers in the background to have that really flamboyant image. And so just three small vignettes here about how space can be used differently, how it can be applied through different people for different reasons, and the fact that we have to think about the context in all these different locations. And part of that also comes through in the way in which we use terminology. So throughout this module we will talk about green infrastructure, but we will also talk about nature-based solutions, which are NBS, greenways, GW, ecosystem services, green spaces, green belts, biophilic cities. And one of the positives of this is that this terminology allows us to look at different disciplines, different geographical interpretations, to think about how we might be using nature or ecology or societal understandings of the environment to better structure and manage the physical landscape. But one of the problems associated with this is a partitioning of knowledge and a partitioning of expertise, as people try to look at a certain concept rather than the broader discussions. So currently we're having a discussion in Europe about whether nature-based solutions are the most effective terminology to invest in urban nature. Many would say yes, because the EU are funding these quite heavily, whereas other people might say, well, actually green infrastructure is a more overarching term which allows you to think about water and climate and people and the economy more effectively. And so one thing that we'll do over the course of the module is look at how terminology is being used, where it's being used, and how that is shaping the way in which GI can be implemented, and where it can be seen as a hindrance to effective development or sustainable development of urban areas. And so it's something that we'll come back to probably more so in the front part of the lecture series rather than towards the end. In addition, we'll talk about temporality and the fact that GI is a constantly evolving set of systems. So ecologically it constantly evolves, but also societally it evolves as well. The things that we find attractive, the things that we find functional, are not the same now as they were 10 years ago or 50 or 100 years ago. And we can see this through landscape design and the way in which parks in the UK have been designed with different outlooks in mind and with different aesthetic qualities. So University Green compared to, say, Whitworth Park are designed for very different things and in very different ways. But what we will also talk about is the way in which cities are rethinking how they might implement and retrofit green infrastructure in their urban areas. So this is an image from South Korea. This used to be an elevated highway, and they took the highway out, deculverted the river, and made it into a very prominent feature in the city. And so these ideas of retrofitting, of renaturing, are becoming more and more prominent, especially where we're looking at high density urban areas and where we might use infill to look at GI investments. The picture on the right is one of these fanciful renderings, and this one's from Paris, of how we might green the urban areas and have trees in every roof and roof gardens and green walls. And it is a bit fanciful, but we are seeing the start of a conversation where rooftops and walls and their capacity to hold green walls or green roofs is being more seriously discussed in a lot more planning locations. And this is really important if we start to think about how we might address issues of climate change or the long-term environmental impacts of urban areas. So this constant understanding of things do not stay the same all the time is really, really important. And even over the last 15 or 20 years, GI has developed extensively in terms of what it is, what it's supposed to do, the categorization and the classifications of its different resources, but also in terms of what it delivers and the benefits that they may be. And again, we'll talk about that quite extensively. In addition, we'll talk about issues of proportionality. So how big or how small should GI be, and what should it try to do? And just three examples here from Atlanta on the left, Milan in the middle, and Brasilia on the right, where you look at the way in which projects such as the Parco Sur and the Parco Nord in Milan are being used to integrate urban and rural environments through what they call urban woodlands. So they're allowing people to move beyond the city limits via woodlands and connected features. In Atlanta with the Beltline, you've got a 23-mile trail around the city, which is allowing people to engage with nature on a ward-by-ward basis. And in Brasilia, you've got a designed city where GI was put into each of the super blocks, and you've got the big sort of aeroplane motif there with two large parks and a big lake. But with all these things, you can ask, is the amount of green infrastructure being developed actually sufficient or appropriate for the people who need to use it. So you might argue that the super blocks in Brasilia are really well designed because they're almost self-contained communities, but their access to green infrastructure is maybe limited because of the nature of the layout. Whereas with the Atlanta Beltline, because it goes through each of the 40 plus districts and wards in the city, it allows everybody to have a more convenient and localized accessibility to GI. And that's quite important. It's something that we'll come back to again and again. And linked to this is this notion of functionality and what we actually want our green infrastructure in our urban areas to do. And again, 3 images, one from Ahmedabad in India, one from Salford, and one from Berlin. The picture in Ahmedabad might not look that very much, but this square was redesigned about 10 years ago, and they planted trees there. And the trees were there to add shade and make this place less inhospitable in the summer, and particularly in times of peak temperatures. And what they've seen is that it actually drew people back to the square, which was previously underused. So the design and the use of trees has been really, really appropriate in terms of repurposing the square as a functional and interactive space. The trees in the middle are from Salford, and it's a sud system, and there's an interpretation board just off here, but it's showing that even small-scale interventions can have quite a significant impact on water flow and urban sort of climatology. And it's in a place where you wouldn't normally see it, so it stands out as something quite bold and quite innovative. And these little things can have a quite significant impact on the way in which we understand the urban environment. And finally, the picture on the right there is, but it's not from Berlin. It's from New Orleans. So I apologise. And seeding tram lines to actually take away some of the harshness of the concrete, but also to add a linear green ecological feature corridor that goes across the city, allowing potentially certain species to move up and down, but also to provide a location where rainfall can permeate and to take off some of the surface water flooding. So we will talk about SUDS, we will talk about water management throughout the semester, but also the way in which we look at the environment and how the different social, economic and ecological functions can work together for us. And part of this conversation also has to reflect on the economy and the costs and benefits of green infrastructure, because we see a lot of investment in housing development or transport infrastructure, and there's a lesser conversation about the value of green infrastructure. One is because it's quite difficult to put a monetary value on nature because there's so many tangible and intangible variables to think about. But we are starting to see a growing realisation and a growing understanding of the economic benefits that can be drawn from high quality green space, and that could be health and well-being and people not going to hospital, it could be increased real estate prices, or it could be social interaction and therefore less antisocial behaviour. And the picture on the left here is from the Thamesmead estate, which is a very large purpose-built social housing estate run by the Peabody Trust. And if you walk around it, it's actually embedded in a network of green infrastructure, which in many cases is actually quite hard to get to, but it does allow you to move around without needing a car or to walk on the main roads. So it serves the purpose of people who may not have access to a private vehicle. Picture on the right is from central Shanghai, where this building firm are using nature and particularly clean air, the water, the woodlands, as a way of trying to sell an exclusivity of a design. Whether there will be green infrastructure in this design is open to question, and the way in which GI is being used for branding or for marketing is something that we will talk about as a way of increasing real estate value, but then think about what it actually might give back. And finally, one of the things that we'll come back to over and over again is notions of responsibility, governance and management. So who should be involved in the management of GI? Who should be paying for it? Who should be developing it? Should it be city governments, such as the New York City's sort of GI plan here? Should it be a Quango, so a non-governmental organisation like Cambridge Horizons? Or should it be the private sector, so Grosvenor in this case, with their Living Cities approach to development? And what we will talk about here is the interaction between government, developers, society and the environment / charity / third sector, and the way in which they can be used, or the way in which they can think about integrating their skills and their expertise to develop green infrastructure projects. And so this is just a brief overview of some of the ideas we might be talking about throughout the semester. I hope you found it useful, and we'll pick up on this on Thursday in the first lecture. So see you all soon.